Okay, so I finally got smart and I audio taped the information for you, and now I can look at my notes and share it. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. This is taken from a part of Doug Vogt's book called God's Day of Judgment, The Real Cause of Global Warming, which is very in-depth and enlightening and took me a number of years to understand thoroughly because I have a theological background and not a science, although I love science. And you'll see as I share how I put the pieces together, and maybe that'll help you too, because I'm telling you, I was blessed to have gotten to spend time and have Doug as a mentor, and he taught me a lot. I'm not saying that he and I are in agreement about everything. Rest in peace. He died in December of 23. And I wish he were still here. However, this is dedicated to him, and I hope you enjoy learning this stuff as much as I did. And I've tried really hard not to get off track with my own agenda. So Doug tells this story about in World War II in the Pacific, there was a tribe, and they watched airplanes come over their island all the time, but they had no idea what they were. And then when an anthropology team went into the island later and talked to them, the first thing they noticed was that this tribe of people that didn't have any input from outside their little island had built a plane out of tree pieces and palm leaves and were treating it like a god. And so isn't that interesting? A good lesson. Their technology was so primitive that they couldn't begin to interpret an airplane. And I think that might be where we are today. So they put this airplane in a category of magic and said it was God. Okay, today our society is about the same, but we deal with unknown phenomena. Academia hides it, denies it exists. Government won't fund it. Crazy. So we have to dig up information for ourselves. And fortunately, I was lucky enough to have Doug teach me what he had dug up, and then I was able to add a lot to it. Okay. So let's talk about Moses's rod, because that is one of the key parts of understanding what the Torah really was and the messages that I really believe it was trying to give us. By the time I'm finished with this part, you might be very skeptical, and that's okay. Let it come to you, but ask questions. And maybe your questions will help me to ask more questions. Although I've done a lot of work on this, and I am pretty darn sure he was on the right track in a lot of areas. So what was Moses's rod? Based on the references in the Hebrew scriptures and the legends of the Jews, which was written by Josephus, who was fake, but it still got information in it, Doug believed that it was much more than a walking stick for a shepherd. We know from the Hebrew alphabet that I've done several lessons on from partially what I learned from Doug, shows that we're dealing with a highly advanced civilization from the past in the Bible. And like so many other things, it requires a lot of understanding of the foundational physics, geometry, numbers, computer programming to understand the story that's being communicated. So when one of the first things that I shared from Doug was his theory of multidimensional reality, and how that he had come to the conclusion that we live in an information system. He was he was a theologian and a scientist, and brilliant, and was raised as a Jewish son and had all that background. He also had a lot of experience in the military as a photographer, a journalist, wrote a lot of books, so his credentials are definitely there. Although, if you look him up, our people that think they know everything don't speak too highly of him, and that's probably why he's not here. So, if we could go to a planet where history had been properly recorded, that was trustworthy, and they had been there for tens of thousands of years, then you would see an advancement, right? But here we are, and it looks like we have demoted in so many areas. And how do we know that? Well, when you go back and look, and I'm getting off track, when you go back and look, archaeology shows us that. In Harappan and some of those older Turkey civilizations, they had complete sewer and water and all kinds of things. And then you don't have to go far in India to see that they absolutely knew about energy and power. And how did they build those buildings? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Doug concluded, and I agree, that Moses' rod was much more than a wooden stick, that it was technology. There are many times that the rod showed up in the Hebrew scriptures. The first was the Garden of Eden, and then in Gideon's story in Judges, and it's described as a rod of God, or the right hand, because Moses held the rod in his right hand. It's mentioned cryptically by many of the prophets, writing that a rod will appear in the future. It's in the Garden of Eden story. It's assumed, based on the literary references, that the Garden of Eden is located near in the same area as Mount Sinai. And there's a Jewish tradition that should be mentioned that says the first time the Torah mentions something is the most important time. So keep that in mind. So the rod first appears in Genesis after the creation. And it's an allegory, something to do with the evolution of man and a highly advanced civilization. Sometime in the far distant past, like maybe 12,000, 3,000, 6,000, 12,000 years, we know that things happen in cycles. The society has evolved to build, had evolved, and we're probably talking about whatever, maybe the Anunnaki, but that Sumerian civilization that came before the Bible. The Epic of Gilgamesh is where we get the first creation story that the Bible probably copied. But the Epic of Gilgamesh creation story leads us to believe that they were very highly advanced, and everything points to that. So, after the creation of the universe, God created a garden in an area in Eden where the types of food bore, or the trees and plants had seeds, and everything in there was food bearing. It was a garden, and there was a tree of life in the midst of the garden, and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So God tells Adam, representing man, that he can eat of all the trees, all the plants, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, no, because he'll die. And he'll be like God, and that won't be good. The serpent at the beginning of chapter 3 is introduced as the seducer of Eve, representing woman and her material, or the materialistic nature of normal man. The serpent tells Eve that if she eats of the fruit, she won't die, and says, God knows that when you eat of that fruit, that good apple, your eyes will open and you'll be like him. And the woman looked at the apple and said, looks good to me. I wouldn't mind being wise. Why not? And then she gave a bite to Adam. And he took it, and he didn't have to. Now think about food. Food doesn't make you wise, although indirectly it does. But information makes us wise. So here we can begin to assume that it probably wasn't food, but information that was being talked about. The story continues with God discovering what had happened when he was walking through the garden. God ends the stay in the garden with this decision. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. That didn't sound right. My notes aren't helping me. Maybe I should just tell it. So anyway, you get the point. God said, you put your hand forth, you ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so he sent him out of the garden to walk the ground of dirt from where he was taken. And so it was to know good and evil. He put forth his hand and took from the tree of life. Okay, that doesn't make sense. I don't know, maybe it did make sense. I don't like doing it like this. I'm better just talking it, but I'm going to keep going. Are you with me? And if not, we'll get it straightened out, because I don't want to back up, and I got to quit this thing if I quit it. Okay, so I can just take over and think it through here. So start with the analysis of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They must be one object. In chapter 2:17, is it? God says, but of the tree of knowledge, it's presented there as singular. And in chapter 3:3, when Eve says to the serpent, but of the fruit of the tree, which is in the midst of the garden, it's also there described as singular. Therefore, it makes sense to conclude that both abilities are in one tree. The next concept to consider is that the tree is not really a tree, but a structure. Like eating food, it doesn't really mean taking in food, but it means consuming or absorbing information or knowledge. Since the fruit of the tree isn't really fruit, It's not really an apple, it's a symbol. So the phrase, put forth his hand, indicates that some device or tool was in Adam's hand. And the serpent is not really a snake, but a tool. So the tree, I have so many Bible teachings about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and I studied under Arthur Burt, and I think I did good until just now.